And we are live. 4, 3, 2. Sorry to break it to you. But the Devin we all knew and loved is gained overnight.
That's actually during communion.
No, I'm kidding. I don't know. I don't know where it's at. He's coming. He asked me about it. There it is. That's his mom. Yeah, we're gonna be live. We're gonna be live. Oh man. He's here.
Friday night and then Saturday all day. That's hard to because where are you going to that? I thought maybe we could go back.
Okay, welcome. I don't have any. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, so I don't have any announcements, but we're gonna love each other now, and then we'll get started. So, 3, hands waving.
Oh, I thought you were doing like that. There we go. No, but like we were matching that lady's shirt. Huh? That lady's shirt matching her shoes. Okay. So I was like, I felt them. Really? Is he like a neat lady? Are you going to Federico's pool party? At his grandma's house? I can tell you where it is. You're invited now. It's like anyone go. When is it? Tuesday. Like at night. Like 7 to 10 or 11.
to sing for all that you've done for me. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, worthy, worthy of this is amazing grace.
gathering us all here together tonight to worship you and to get to know you and to love you. Lord, I pray for Sammy and I pray for her message. God, I pray that we all have open ears tonight and get to hear your word through her and you speak through her. I know that she's really excited and she's grown a lot over this summer interning for the Grace Project, Lord. So please be with her and give her courage to just speak your truth and our hearts to be open to what she has to say. And I pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay, while you are getting situated, we're going to be in Mark 2. Mark 2 verses 23 through 28, and as well as Exodus 20 verses 8 and 11. Okay, so a few years ago, I was riding in the car with one of my friends, and she was speeding. And I'm not going to say any names because we got Roger here. Don't want to get anyone in trouble. But also I'm going to say it was not Kaylee. She's very strict about speed limits and not speeding. She does not want a ticket. She made it very clear to Amber and I when we went on our little road trip that we were to not speed in her car. So it wasn't her. But anyways, when I noticed her accelerated speed, I mentioned to her how she was going pretty fast. And she was like, well, I have seen police officers speed without their lights on before, so I think I'm justified to speed as well. And I didn't quite agree with her logic there, but what I am wondering is, Roger, have you ever done that?
That's your lawyer, do not answer that question.
So my guess is you probably don't agree with her logic either. But you and I do that. When it comes to the Ten Commandments, we generally think they should still be followed. We know we shouldn't have idols. We know we shouldn't steal. We wouldn't want someone coming into our homes and taking things. You probably get a little angry. We know we shouldn't commit adultery. Go ahead and ask your spouse if you can do that. They're going to say no and maybe smack you just for asking. And we know we probably shouldn't murder. There might be a coworker or a classmate that just really gets on your nerves that you think, but then you think, better not. But when it comes to the Sabbath, we generally brush that one off like it's no big deal. Why is that? Why is it that we follow all of the other ones, but when it comes to the Sabbath, we act as if it doesn't matter? My guess is because we see Jesus address the Sabbath, and we use that. He also does work on the Sabbath, so we use that as a pass to just ignore the commandment about the Sabbath and do work or whatever we feel like doing on that day. But what if we have misunderstood Jesus' actions? What if by misunderstanding his actions, we misunderstood God's intention for the Sabbath in our lives? And by misunderstanding that, we're missing what God could do and, frankly, what God wants to do in our lives through the Sabbath. So let's look at the commandment about the Sabbath, and then we'll look at what Jesus says about it. So Exodus 20, 8 through 11 says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So I read out of the ESV translation instead of the NLT because the way it's worded, I think, would be the more accurate translation from the Hebrew text. And the distinction between the two, although it's very small, I think it plays a significant role in understanding and interpreting this commandment in our lives. So the first part of it is remember the Sabbath day. And the key word here is remember. So remembering is more than just an act, or more than just like a mental act. It is an active observance. It's like a wedding anniversary. you do more than just recall that date to mind. You do some form of active remembrance for that. And I'm sure that anyone who has forgotten a wedding anniversary can attest that some form of concrete demonstration of remembrance is expected. You might give gifts, go out to dinner, go on a trip, maybe to Italy. You might spend a romantic evening together, if you know what I'm saying. And there's this song that it's Your Grace Is Enough. And when I was younger in church, it always frustrated me and confused me a little bit because there's a line in it that says, remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. And that always confused me because, like, why on earth do we need to sing to God, remember us? Surely he hasn't forgotten who his people are, and we don't need to be singing a song saying, hey, remember us. But so it wasn't until I was researching for this sermon that when I was reading some commentaries, it referenced a passage in Exodus 2, 23 through 25 that says, during those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cries for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So when it says that he remembered his covenant, it wasn't just that he had forgot it and then he remembers it. And it's like, oh yeah, I promised him this. But it was that he heard their cries and he moved into action. And that's how he remembered them. That when he saw that they were in slavery and he heard their crying out and asking him to free them, he sent Moses to deliver them out of Egypt and bring them to the promised land. And that is how God remembered his people. And when it wasn't until last Sunday when we were singing that song in church, I was sitting in the back and I had been writing things down for the sermon, and those words came on, and the worship band was singing it. Remember your people, remember your promise. Remember your children, remember your promise. And it was like a light bulb in my head that was like, oh my gosh, that's what it's referring to, this time when God heard the cries of his people and he remembered them. And it made that song make sense to me for the first time. And I just saw the beauty in it and how beautiful it is that God remembered them and delivered them out of slavery. And in the same way that God remembered his people with action, I think we're called to remember the Sabbath with action. So the second part of the commandment is to keep it holy. And now that's the reason I read the ESV translation, because it says to keep it holy, whereas the NLT version says by keeping it holy. And although those are two really small words that don't seem like they play that much of a significant role, I think they play a huge role in understanding how we should be applying this commandment in our lives. So because it says to keep it holy, what that's doing is drawing attention back to the remembering part. It's saying that the actions that you do for remembering is what keeps this day holy. And that the important part is remembering the day rather than it being holy. And when you say by keeping it holy, what it's drawing attention to is the keeping it holy part, and that the important part is that this day stays holy rather than remembering it. And as we'll see in Mark, that there's those both views going on. Jesus saw it as you remember this day, and that's what gives value to it. That because you are doing these certain things and choosing to do certain things and choosing not to do certain things is what makes this day holy and gives it its value. And he also points out the true intention of this commandment in our lives. Whereas the Pharisees, they saw it as that this day is already holy, and they boxed it in with all these requirements and restrictions. And because there were these requirements and restrictions, we miss the true intention of what the Sabbath was and what it's supposed to be doing in our lives. And so let's look at the passage in Mark and see how Jesus says the commandment is supposed to play out in our lives. So it says, one Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking of heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the scriptures where David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the day where Abiathar was high priest, and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. So in verses 23 and 24, we see the disciples, Jesus' disciples, breaking heads of grain to eat on a Sabbath. And that was illegal with all of the Sabbath laws that the Pharisees had created. And so the Pharisees addressed Jesus and asked him, "Why are you letting your disciples break Sabbath law?" And Jesus responds in verses 25 and 26 by pointing back to Scripture to a time when David and his companions went into the house of God, and they had nothing to eat, and they were hungry, and there was no other bread available for them to eat, only the sacred loaves that was forbidden for anyone to eat except the priests. And he took them, and he ate and shared with his companions. And what the significance of the Old Testament occurrence and the New Testament with Jesus and his disciples is that in both occurrences, devoutly religious men did something that was forbidden. And the fact that David was never condemned by God for doing that is Jesus' way of showing that the Pharisees are too strict with they're taking the laws too far with the Sabbath, and that their restrictions and requirements are not in tune with that of the law. And so and then in verse 27, Jesus is pointing out the true intention of the Sabbath. And he says that the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So what Jesus is saying here is that it's made to meet our needs. It's not supposed to be this thing that we box in and construct, our lives around to keep it holy. But the day is supposed to meet our needs, and that when you put all of these restrictions around it, it doesn't do that. It doesn't work because it's not doing the purpose that it was supposed to be doing in our lives. It wasn't doing what it was created for, because we have to go under these restrictions and because we're trying to follow all of these restrictions, that doesn't help us. It really harms us in the end when we're trying to work our lives around all of these restrictions that they put. And so Jesus is saying that that's not the purpose of the Sabbath. The purpose is to meet our needs, because God saw what we needed. He saw that in creation, when he was creating, he saw that we would need a day of rest. And so he created that. The Sabbath was still a part of creation. Creation wasn't over until God rested on the seventh day. And that's what Jesus is bringing to light here, that it doesn't work with the way the Pharisees is doing, but it's what we do that makes this day holy, and that's the important part, is that we get rest because that's what we need. And the Sabbath is a day of rest. It's a day for us to see the gifts that God has already provided in our lives, and to be with family and community. And we can't put these regulations around something like that, because it takes away the meaning and the importance in our lives. And when we do that, it just ends up harming us. And so what does this mean to us in terms of Sabbath practice? Jesus wasn't saying that we no longer remember the Sabbath. What Jesus was saying was that we can't put these regulations and restrictions around, because that's not the point. and that you have to do some form of remembrance in order to allow this day to do what it was created for. And it was created to meet our needs. But when we're ignoring it and we're not taking the initiative to experience the Sabbath, we don't get that, and we don't get what it's intended for. And so what you and I have to figure out is how we're going to experience the Sabbath each week. And I think there are so many ways that we can experience it. When we leave the day free without all of these restrictions and regulations, it creates an open space for us to experience the Sabbath in so many different ways. You could go out to Lincoln Trail and spend some time in quiet, just reflecting and praising God. You can spend time with your family and seeing how God has provided for your family and met the needs that you had. You can spend the day worshiping and praising Him and coming to some form of worship service. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that when we allow the day to do what it was intended, we are freed to do so many things in order to worship God and experience the Sabbath. But what you and I can't do is ignore God's command, because we are still supposed to be experiencing the Sabbath. And just because we saw Jesus do work on the Sabbath doesn't mean that was telling us that it no longer counts or it's no longer important, because it is. And it's for our needs. And God knows those needs. And that's why He created it. During Zeteo this year, we read the book Slow Church. And I'm sure you guys have heard that 100 times by now. But one of the chapters in that book was the Sabbath. And I really enjoyed that chapter, which is probably why I'm preaching about the Sabbath right now. And one of the authors talked about how his small group decided to start experiencing the Sabbath. And he shared that in his family, they chose to experience it on Saturdays. They chose not to eat out, but to only cook locally, homemade meals bought from local ingredients. And they also chose not to use electronics all day. I know some of you might be thinking that's impossible, but they did it, so it can be done. Not saying that has to be a part of your Sabbath, but they chose that it was a part of their Sabbath. And the meals that they created, they did it together, and they shared it with friends and family. He shared how in the afternoons they would play games, they would read, they would take naps. If they needed to go to the store, they all went as a family. If they needed to do chores, they did them as a family. And he just shared how fruitful it was for his family to be experiencing the Sabbath together. And I think that story just shows the beauty of it, that we can do so many different things to experience it. And when we don't take the time to do that, we miss out on that beauty. We miss out on what God could be doing in our lives because we're not even taking the time to experience it. When I was like in the 6th grade through high school, my sister Alexis, my Aunt Nancy, and I would go to church on Sunday mornings, and then we would go home and to my aunt's house, and we'd cook dinner together. Sometimes it would just be the 3 of us. Sometimes it would be more family, but we would eat together. Sometimes we'd go out. We didn't decide that we couldn't eat out on Sundays. So sometimes we would do that, but most of the time we would be at her house. In the afternoons, we would play games. We would watch movies. If we needed to go to the store, we would go together or go to Terre Haute or anything like that. But we were together. And some of my favorite memories with both my sister and my Aunt Nancy were experienced on Sunday afternoons when we were together. And we had countless laughs. We had a few cries in there. sometimes when I needed it and I needed a lecture, I would get that and a kick in the right direction to make sure my life was headed in the right path. And I wouldn't trade those memories and experiences for the world. And what I realized after writing this sermon was that was us experiencing the Sabbath. Even though I didn't realize it, we were as a family creating a space to grow, a space to realize what God has provided in our lives, to just be with each other. And that's what Sabbath is about. And I want to keep experiencing that. I want to keep experiencing the Sabbath like I did when I was younger, because it shaped me into the person I am today. And without those times and experiences, I don't know where I would be. And I'm so thankful. So I want to continue to experience the Sabbath. And I hope that you guys want to experience that too. And I can just picture the things that God can do in our lives if we give him the space to do it. And that space is a part of the Sabbath. And so what would it look like if this week or this month we decided to spend one day a week experiencing the Sabbath as individuals, within your family, and as a church body? We just took the time to experience the Sabbath and see what God could do in our lives. Let's pray. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for all that you do in our lives, and that you see our needs and you meet them, and that a part of those needs that we have is the Sabbath. And I thank you for creating a day that we can rest, a day that we can slow down and be still, and that we can see what you have provided for us, and we can be thankful, and we can worship you, and we can have a space to grow. I'm so thankful for that. And I just pray that this week and this month we can just experience that, and we can grow and worship you and be still, because the world around us never seems to stop. But with you, we can trust that the world will keep going, even when we stop and rest. And I just pray all of this in your name. Amen.
Nice job, Sam.
Be
communion. So I've scattered around the trays, and I ask that when you get the bread and the juice that you hold it, so the answer can all take it together. So you can go ahead and start asking. Body of Christ, broken for you. Blood of the new covenant, shed for you. Alright, I'd like to call us into a time of prayer. I'll give you time to pray by yourselves, and then I'll bring it to a close. Lord, I'm asking that you allow us to lay our sins in front of you and allow you to come into our lives, Lord. I'm asking you that you let us take Sam's message home with us today and apply it into our own lives. I'd also like to thank you for giving us Sam